Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1, where we challenge the assumptions of our current society to resist oppression and investigate alternative ways of living, for a world based on justice, solidarity and sustainability. Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1 FM, your local community radio station. My name is Andy. I'll be here for the next hour. We're broadcasting on Yagara and Turrbal country, and today we are going to be hearing from Liz Pelly, who is an American music journalist. She is going to be coming to Australia shortly and will in fact be in our city of Brisbane on Sunday the 31st of August to do a talk about her recent book called Mood Machine, which is a critique of the well-known music streaming platform Spotify, and the way it has affected both the listening to and the making of music. Of course, it has been in the news recently, Spotify, with a number of artists announcing that they will be boycotting it, pulling their music off it, in protest about various things about Spotify's model. But the final straw was the news that Daniel Ek, the CEO of Spotify, the lead investor in an AI weapons company called Helsing, making autonomous weapons to get ready for the future apocalyptic battle between robots and humans, and to be on the robot side. Before then, they will, of course, be used by humans, the rich humans who can afford the AI weapons, so can then fight wars without having to send any people there at the risk of dying, and so they don't have to risk any casualties in the wars that they fight. So the poor humans who can't afford AI weapons will be the ones who die and don't have a chance to fight back. That is the immediate use of AI weapons. The later use is in the apocalyptic battle for our planet between the robots and humans, which is to come. But that's for another episode of the Paradigm Shift. But anyway, back to Spotify. Daniel Ek, the CEO, he's invested hundreds of millions of dollars of his own money, as well as by doing that, you try to encourage other rich people to invest in this company. And he's like the chairman of the board of Helsing. Anyway, Daniel Ek, he's not doing good things with the money that he has made from other people's music, which just happens to be on his platform. And so that has been the final straw, which has led to a lot of musicians pulling their music from the platform. And so that's what is coming up. Liz Pelly, she has been studying the ins and outs of Spotify for a long time, writing about it, both its business practices and I guess what it's done to music, which I think is significant. I think a lot of online platforms, they are changing us as we use them, and we're not always conscious of the ways that this is done. And so it is good to have somebody like Liz really lay it out in her new book, Mood Machine, but also in the essays that she's been writing for a few years. And so let's have a listen to Liz.
Hi, my name is Liz Pelly. I'm a music journalist. I live in New York City, and I am recently the author of Mood Machine, The Rise of Spotify, and the Costs of the Perfect Playlist.
Yeah, which is what we're going to be talking about today. But I think maybe before we get into your critiques of Spotify, I guess do you want to give us a bit of a background of like what you love about music? What's been your involvement in music that's led you to be such a prominent Spotify critic?
Yeah, so I've been involved in local and underground music since I was a teenager. Like a lot of us, I think, who are drawn to the more independent and experimental and grassroots corners of music. I started going to shows when I was a kid in my local music scene. I was really active on like MySpace and LiveJournal, and those were sort of early entry points into some sort of idea of local music. And I mean, you know, like many other people in college, I was really involved in college radio, and that was sort of another kind of entry point into being more involved in local music where I went to college and booking house shows. And it's honestly just, you know, really integral to my life, my social life, how I know most of my friends. But yeah, it's that. And in addition to being a music journalist, I also have, you know, long been involved in all ages show booking. I lived at a music venue for a while. I'm in a band. So I think, yeah, it's just like being a participant in DIY music has kind of influenced the way I think about music. Like lots of other people who are involved in independent music who know that alternatives are possible, and that being involved in independent music also kind of involves this constant negotiation or sort of rearticulation of what that even means. Like, you know, even looking at some texts from the 90s, like a, you know, article that made a really big impact on me when I read it years and years ago is Alternative to What from the Baffler in 1993. And that type of question, like alternative to what, independent from what, is something that in the streaming era, it was becoming really clear that if the idea of independent music was going to sort of like have any meaning or hold up, or maybe even like the phrase independent music, but like the concept of fostering kind of like countercultural alternative in opposition to the status quo. It's like, okay, well, what the status quo in music looks like is changing. It's not just these major record labels. It's also the media companies that they increasingly are partnered with in a way that is being sold as empowering, you know. So, you know, streaming services, when they launched, needed the music from the major labels in order to launch their beta products. So they signed deals with them for the major labels, and the initial contracts, they got equity stakes. So when Spotify launched in Europe in 2008, and then later in the United States in 2011, they were 18% owned by the major labels. At the same time, independent artists were being sold this narrative that these platforms were going to be like leveling the playing field, democratizing music. And there's just kind of, you know, before even really starting to research the intricacies of those partnerships, those equity stakes, the ownership of these platforms, it just kind of early on seemed like there was something wrong with that narrative that needed to be debunked a little bit.
Yeah, so you have written Mood Machine, which is a book-length critique of Spotify. And it's interesting, it's become sort of topical in the last few weeks of different artists talking about boycotting Spotify, and maybe we'll get to that later. But let's talk about Mood Machine, and I guess, do you want to give us a bit of a quick overview of sort of what the book's about?
Yeah, so it's a book that looks at the impacts of streaming on music from a few different perspectives. There's the kind of first part of the book is a little bit more about, in addition to, you know, the history of the company, the rise of Spotify in Sweden, the first half of the book really focuses on the impact of the streaming model on listeners. So when you open a streaming service, what are you looking at? Why is it there? What's impacting the way music sounds, the way that music is curated. I specifically look at the Spotify playlist as a sort of cultural phenomenon, and not even just the Spotify playlists, there's different types of Spotify playlists. There's editorial playlists, algorithmic playlists, and something in the middle, what they call an algotorial playlist. So kind of like look at those types of playlists, but then I specifically look at the concept of like the chill vibes playlist as a sort of like unique streaming era phenomenon. What does this represent about the way that listening is being shaped by streaming services? What does it say about the way streaming services sort of encourage this like functional use of music? So like that's kind of the first half of the book. And then the second half of the book is a bit more focused on the labor issues for artists, what it means. I talk about the royalty model, what it means for musicians to be so reliant on streaming apps as like new types of bosses, and kind of look at the Spotify for Artists app, which is kind of like the artist-facing Spotify app. And towards the end of the book, I get into like, looking at the rise of different musician solidarity organizations and efforts, unionizing efforts, and sort of try to point to some solutions of different ways to think about digital music in the streaming era.
It's interesting, I guess, and your title of your book, Mood Machine, is sort of, I guess, referencing those kind of chill vibes playlists and this Spotify core, I used to call it jokingly, of like, one thing that you noticed all the time was these acoustic covers of older pop songs or something like that. That was before I feel like it became as sort of ubiquitous as it is now. But I think that's interesting because a lot of the critique has been about the payment to artists and more recently about where they invest their money. But it is, one of the things we should be aware of is, I guess, how it's changing the way that we listen to music, first and foremost, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the very first article... Sorry, not the very first article. The second article that I ever wrote about Spotify in 2017 was called The Problem with Muzak. And the title was kind of a callback to this Steve Albini piece in The Baffler in 1993 also called The Problem with Music, where he was talking about the major label system. And that piece, The Problem with Muzak, was sort of looking at the ways in which streaming was sort of encouraging this more passive, lean-back relationship with music, and from my perspective and the perspective of some musicians and people running independent record labels who I interviewed for that piece, almost sort of reimagining music as a type of neo-muzak, to use the term for like bland background music of the 1930s, 40s, 50s that you would hear in like a shopping mall or a grocery store, or that would be playing in the background of an office. And even back then in 2017, I think one of the quotes from that early piece that seemed to resonate with a lot of people was this one person from an independent record label saying that streaming was turning all music into emotional wallpaper. So I think in some sense the title of the book like kind of is like a callback to that kind of concept, but also now it's interesting also at a time where there's a lot of concern about AI and generative AI. I think there's also a lot in the book not necessarily about, there's a chapter about generative AI music in the book certainly, but what I think is even more urgent or concerning is not only generative AI music, but the ways in which for the past 10, 15 years, different things that could be called AI, like algorithmic recommendations, hyper-personalized recommendation feeds, autoplay, artist radio, niche mixes, all of these different automated, you could say AI-driven discovery products have kind of been integral to strengthening this product and the ideas about music and culture that it sort of seeks to normalize. On to that end, there's kind of this subplot running through a few chapters of the book looking into how over the years Spotify executives have really endeavored to like make the process of delivering the perfect recommendation at the perfect moment as frictionless as possible using algorithms. And that's definitely kind of a bit of, I think, what the title is gesturing towards as well.
Yeah, one of the things that I've thought is that even though all the music in the world is on Spotify, and it's an incredible tool actually for young people discovering music, and it makes it a lot easier than it would have been when me or you were growing up, but that there's something that just the format of it removes the context from music. And so these things, even like, oh, I went to this record store and got that record, or I saw this band play, or my friend likes this music, you know, these kind of things that actually the sort of meta-narrative that gives music a lot of meaning is kind of lost with Spotify. And it's hard to explain that to people who are just excited about having all this access to all this music.
Yeah, I actually think that, kind of millennial generation music fans who grew up with access to file sharing are in this sort of weird in-between where in some ways the idea of having access to all of the music in the world isn't that novel to us, because, even though in order to own music when we were growing up, we had to go to a record store and buy a CD, or go to the library and check out a stack of CDs and rip them to our computers. The ability to just hear something, whether it was through like file sharing or YouTube or whatever, like wasn't that far out of reach. Whereas maybe for other generations, the idea of like having access to all the music in the world feels more novel because they literally had to like read a magazine for a description to even know what something sounded like. Anyway, that's a little bit of a divergence from you said, but yeah, it's interesting because there's all these ways that you could imagine, right? A tool like this doing a lot more to offer context and meaning and connection around music. There's so many ways that digital technology or the way music is contextualized through something like a streaming service could create pathways of more connection and around musical lineages, histories, record label context, like players appearing across records, all this stuff that they don't. I mean, that wouldn't solve all of the labor issues of streaming, of course, but there's a lot of reasons why they don't. And I think one of them is just that streaming services endeavor to really tightly control the user experience, and they want people to be listening to music on their terms. Streaming, Spotify, for example, used to have more social features. You used to be able to DM people. There used to be an apps marketplace where third-party app makers could build discovery tools right within Spotify, and most of those features did not last long. Third-party playlisters used to have a lot more influence, and I think it makes sense because ultimately, like, what a streaming service wants is to be able to have more control over the user experience, point people towards material that is more favorable to them for users to stream, whether it be due to marketing agreements, label partners they're trying to please, their own cost-saving initiatives like discovery mode, or just simply wanting their product to feel frictionless and wanting to try to like iron out those frictions. But as often gets said in the era of hyper convenience, algorithms, personalized feeds, instant gratification, whatever, like friction is part of how connections are made. It's part of how community is formed. It's part of how we learn. This like pursuit of ironing out all of the frictions around music sharing and discovery is ultimately, I think one of the most culturally devastating aspects of the streaming economy.
let's talk a bit about Spotify as a company and I guess the economics of it. To start off with, there's the issue of the payment for artists, which of course, when you look at it as a number per stream, it is incredibly small. I guess, what are your thoughts on that? Like, could it be higher and Spotify still be a viable business model? Should artists be pushing for a higher rate? Or what should be the response?
Yeah, so artists on streaming services, and it's more or less the same business model for all major streaming platforms. So we can talk about Spotify, and I talk about Spotify in the book, but the economic model is like more or less like pretty much the same across major platforms. Artists aren't paid directly, so actually there is no per stream rate, right? Like there's the average of what artists report having earned, but streaming services don't pay artists directly. They pay rights holders. So if you're a musician, that might be like your distributor. If you're on a major label, the major labels license their music directly to streaming services. If you're on an independent label, you might be represented by digital rights organization like the Merlin Network, or might be your distributor, like self-serve distributor. Anyway, the streaming companies pay those rights holders and they get paid on a pro rata basis. So rather than paying per stream, it's according to market share of the eligible royalty pool. So if you're a major label and your catalog was responsible for 20% of the total streams on a platform during a royalty period, you would be, you would have a claim on 20% of the eligible royalty pool according to what your contract dictates the eligible royalty pool is. So each contract, parses that out differently, and they're all highly secretive, and they're all protected by NDAs. But the thought is that it comes down to on the recorded side, roughly 52% of the revenue. And then it's also pretty commonly understood that major labels have worked out slightly higher rates for themselves, especially there's so many other factors that shape the economics too, what tier was a stream on. Is it a free stream? Is it a paid stream? What country does it come from? Is it coming from someone who is on a family account or a student account? There's all these complicating factors that make it really hard to quantify what the value of a stream is. Certainly there should be a lot more transparency, but anyway, it's not as simple as being artists should negotiate a better deal for themselves. I think the entire pro rata model is in a lot of ways at the heart of what is so complicated but also deeply unfair about streaming economics. There are other models that have been put forth for years, for example, many musicians, organizations, advocacy groups, unions have called for streaming services to adopt something called a user-centric model, where rather than it being this complicated revenue share based on stream share, instead it would be divided up per user. So if I have a subscription to a streaming service for $10 a month, the streaming service takes 30%, the other 70% gets divided up amongst the artists who I actually listened to. So if I only listen to the same musician all month, if I only listen to Camp Cope, shout out my favorite Australian band, they would get my full $7. So that's one way that it could be different.
So on another side of Spotify's business that's been in the news recently is their investment in AI weapons, and this one's caused a lot of news, and it has been the catalyst for artists boycotting. But this isn't actually new, but do you want to tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, so that would be Daniel Ek, the CEO of Spotify's, personal investment. He, in addition to being the CEO and co-founder and chairman of the board of Spotify, Daniel Ek also does other things in the world. He has an investment company that he co-owns called Prima Matera, and that company is the company that made the investment into Helsing. He also is the co-owner of a health tech startup called Nico Health. So, his time is definitely split between lots of different interests. But yeah, I thought that, with the latest news with Daniel Ek's companies leading an investment round into Helsing, it wasn't the first time. In my book I write about how he had also, helped lead an investment round into this company in 2021. He had publicly written this op-ed for Politico where he co-authored it with someone else, where he was kind of encouraging further investment into AI military companies. And then this most recent round of headlines and protesting is about not only him leading another really large investment round into this company, but also becoming the chairman of the board, which puts him in a position of incredible power and influence over this AI weapons company. And I think that I'm personally think that I'm always inspired by musicians staying true to their values and acting on their principles. And it's not surprising that many musicians are, this is particularly, an issue that is motivating artists to finally either leave Spotify or more vocally voice their concerns, because musicians don't want the money, extracted. Musicians don't want their music being used to create all this value for a company like Spotify just for it to be extracted and then used to invest in the military-industrial complex. And I think that that was evidenced by last year. I write in my book I mentioned last year this campaign that United Musicians and Allied Workers was involved in around South by Southwest, called War Profiteers Out of Music.
All right. Spotify's got problems with it. If people weren't already aware of this after reading your book, they certainly would be. What do you think is what we need to do to kind of claim back music to be what we want it to be as musicians, but also as music listeners?
Well, if you're listening to this interview, you're listening to a community radio station, so I'd assume that you're someone for whom music is more than a passing influence. Oftentimes I actually, in answering this question, supporting local community radio is part of the equation, right? When we talk about streaming and imagining alternatives to it, I think it's always, there's so many different ways that the conversation could go depending on who you're talking to. But I think something really unique about streaming is that it sort of, from the early days, has been pitched as a solution, not just an economic solution, but also it's a media product too, right? Streaming was meant to not just replace the record store, but also radio. It's kind of both. It's a media product and it's also a music marketplace. So thinking about ways to more directly support musicians, buying their music directly from them, going to shows, supporting independent music retail, supporting grassroots networks that exist outside the centers of power and culture. Especially so if artists are kind of taking steps to divest from these platforms, going and supporting them on the platforms that they're asking people to kind of follow them to, because I think that's a big risk. A lot of artists right now are experimenting with divestment, trying to convince their fans to support them in other ways. And I think for some artists, they're looking to that and looking to these artists for a blueprint. And if there becomes a viable sort of path, if artists can say oh yeah, I left streaming and my fans and listeners followed me to wherever I went, then that kind of sort of serves to reinforce the idea for other artists that it's possible. So like supporting artists directly, but then also remembering that music media, supporting independent, local, grassroots music media is also important, like whether it be independent radio, newsletters, journalists, zines, etc.
Yeah, bringing it back to the local, to, people focused, not algorithm focused. Sounds good. Okay, well, thanks very much, Liz, for chatting with us today. Do you want to give a final plug for Mood Machine?
Yeah, thank you so much. The book's called Mood Machine. Hope you check it out. And also, I'll be in Brisbane on August 31st at the Institute of Modern Art in the afternoon. I believe it's at 2 p.m., but the information is linked on lizpelly.info/events if you want to find the link.
All right, thanks, Liz.
Thank you so much.
Yes, get behind this local independent radio station. As you just heard Liz Pelly talking about the alternatives to Spotify, they do exist. These local, people-oriented, small media organisations, small music venues, artists, platforms where artists can sell their music, things like that. We just need to get out and be a bit creative, not take the big thing that's marketed at us as the solution to all our problems, but think about in the long term what are the things we care most about. And one of them is certainly having independent media where the voices that aren't heard, that aren't favoured by the algorithm or the advertisers or, the media barons, those voices where they have a space where they can be heard, they can develop and grow, they can build an audience, and that's what we're doing here at 4ZZZ, as well as trying to have conversations with people who are really analysing our society and trying to figure out how we can make it better, which is what we do on the Paradigm Shift every week. And of course, there's so many ways as well you can get involved in not just this station, but other parts of your local music scene, your local activist community. We just need people to be active in creating the world that we want to see. One of the things about these big media corporations is that they thrive on and rely on people's passivity. They want to give you everything you need to know. You don't have to get up off your couch, but the result that we get, it's making it a worse world for all of us. And so a world where we're all active in making things, building community, getting out there, that's going to be a better world for all of us. So get amongst it. I'll see you next week